Hello everyone, this is Dr. Ilyas from the Department of Education, Hazara University, Mansehra. Today we are going to discuss interview data analysis. As we know, interview is one of the main tools of data collection in many qualitative researches. And so many student researchers and junior researchers find it difficult or find it challenging to actually analyze data that has come through the interview. So this particular presentation is aimed at those junior researchers or student researchers um, or PhD and MPhil students in social sciences in general and in the field of education in particular, who have this question on their mind after collecting their data as to how to actually analyze the data that has come through the process of interviewing participants for their researches. So let us see how we proceed and discuss step by step what are the general steps involved in the interview data analysis. Um, Note that this particular presentation is especially aimed at analysis of interview data that has come through the process of semi-structured interviews, because we know that there are different types of interviews, and some interviews are more structured, and there are other interviews that are relatively less structured or unstructured. So this particular presentation is basically aimed at analyzing data um, that comes as a result of semi-structured interviews. So let's see. Okay, so there are a number of steps that are generally involved in the data analysis processes of the data that we get through the semi-structured interviews. Obviously, the first step is to conduct the interview. So the researcher goes and conduct the interview with the participants, and so that's the first step. In many cases, or rather in most cases, interviews are also recorded in some form. They're either recorded in written form or in oral form. So again, this particular presentation is aimed at interviews that are recorded in oral forms through tape recorder or through some other recording device. So after the conduct and recording of the interview, the second step that comes in this process is actually then going back and listening to the record of the interview and listening to the record again. So there is this detailed listening and re-listening of the recorded interview post conduct. And again, after listening and listening again, which actually means listening to the interview transcripts with all the attention that is actually required, the next step that comes is the transcription or the transcribing of the recorded oral interview into some written form. That in these modern times, it comes in the form of transcribing it in the text form through some MS Word, through some word processing in the computers. So transcription actually comes as the second step in this process. And in some cases, interviewers or students might also need to actually translate the interviews if they have conducted the interviews in a language that they are not going to use in their in their thesis. So, for example, the um, if the participants are unable to give interviews in English, and if the thesis or the research paper has to, or the report has to be written in English, the interviewer or the student researcher will have to actually uh, translate the interview transcriptions into the language of the thesis, that in generally in English or in any other language which is actually requisite for that particular thesis. In many cases, it is a good thing, it is a good practice to transcribe and translate the whole of the interview. But in some cases, um, interviewers or researchers might decide to just transcribe and translate certain selected parts of the interviews that they think are um, more relevant for the analysis process and more relevant in line with the research objectives and topic. So after the transcription and in some cases translation, the next step that generally comes is the process of validation, or validating the transcription or the translation of the transcription. Validation actually means in here respondent validation, which actually means that the researcher, after transcribing the interviews, send those transcripts to the participants to and seek their comments and suggestions or possible changes, and to confirm whether the researcher has properly understood what the participants have actually conveyed or properly transcribed the data. And so it's a process of validation that generally is very useful in making the process of interview more authenticated and the data that is coming more authentic. Once this process is done, the next step comes is the step of actual analysis. Although the analysis of interviews actually begin before the interviews and also during the interview when the interview is taking place, the analysis of interview data is a kind of continuous process. Even during the interview, when the interviewer is asking questions, it happens that he or she are actually analyzing the data that is coming in real time. So after that comes the reading and rereading and rereading of the data that has come through the interview. This actually means critical reading time and time again, reading with attention and reading with a critical eye in order to understand the contents and the language and the messages inside the interview texts. And while reading and rereading the interview transcripts, one of the most important things that the researchers need to do at this stage is actually to keep an eye on their objectives and research questions and the theoretical and conceptual frameworks of the research study. Because the researcher is actually aiming at finding answers to their research questions and to actually accomplish the objectives of the research, of the particular research study. And that's why they are not just reading the data for fun or for enjoyment, although that might be a part of it. But they are reading the data in order to find answers to their questions, to their research questions, and in order to achieve the objectives of the study. And they also have the theoretical framework in their minds because they have an overview of the previous studies and research related to this particular topic. So when they are reading the data and rereading the data, they have all those objectives and research questions in their mind that actually help them in analyzing and categorizing and organizing the data in line with their research objectives. After this comes which is actually not the next step. These steps in many cases are overlapping steps. So, but side by side with reading and rereading, one of the practical things that the researchers need to do is to actually highlight, underline important points in the data, important points in the transcripts that they are reading. And so if they're reading the transcripts one by one, which is actually analysis, generally also called within case analysis, they need to highlight or underline important points and highlight, underline important chunks of data. And they also, because in qualitative research, interview research especially, the researchers generally need to make use of direct quotations from the interviews. So they also need to highlight representative quotations, because there will be many quotations related to particular themes. So the researchers have to select the most interesting, the most relevant quotes and chunks of data that they can actually use in order to support the findings and conclusions and themes that they come up with. And at this very stage, the researcher also needs to make summaries, because generally qualitative interview data is quite big in terms of the text that is coming up, in terms of the words that actually have been transcribed. So it is important that the researcher also makes summaries, so that ideas contained in many words are shortened and actually could be used for evidence in the data. And at the same time, critical notes are taken by the researcher while rereading, highlighting, and underlining the chunks of data or the texts and memos, which actually is the researcher's point of views related to particular chunks or particular areas of data that are present in the transcripts. And so the next thing that needs to be done at this stage is actually identifying main ideas. So again, I must reiterate that because this process is a kind of cyclic process, and it's not like in a straight line, it's a kind of cyclic process as well. So there is going back to the transcripts, going back to the objectives and research questions, and going back to the research topics, and then coming back to the data in the interviews, the interview transcripts. And so ultimately the aim is to identify the main ideas and themes or categories that come out as a result of this critical reading and rereading processes. And so there will be themes inside individual interviews, and there will be themes across interviews. And so those themes will have certain sub-themes. There will be super themes, and there will be sub-themes within those super themes. And once those themes are identified, generally in small scale qualitative research is conducted for research degrees such as MPhil and PhD degrees. Interviews generally range between 8, 10, 20 something. And so it is possible for the researcher to actually read the whole of the interviews and then to select quotes from the individual interviews, and then to use those quotes as supports for the themes that come out of those interviews. Generally, a PhD or an MPhil thesis or a research paper, qualitative research paper, will generally have from 5 to 10 main themes. And so there will be representative quotes related to those main themes and to the sub-themes within those main themes. And another very useful thing to do in thematic analysis is basically to draw a thematic map. In some future presentation, I'll give some practical examples of a thematic map, and I'll also give some practical examples of how to actually underline, select, and highlight data or chunks of data related to themes. But in this particular presentation, I actually went through the general steps that are involved in the interview data analysis processes in small-scale qualitative research studies. So once again, to summarize it, interview analysis actually begins at the time of the conduct of interview, and the practical steps that are involved in the interview data analysis begins with the conduct of the interview. And once the interview is conducted, the researchers need to come back and actually to listen to the interview and to listen to it time and time again, a number of times, to transcribe the interview, and in some cases to translate the interview in part or in whole, as a whole. And then the validation process is quite important, which is the respondent validation, which actually means that the interview transcripts are sent back to the respondents in order to validate them and to give them an opportunity to look at what they have conveyed, what they have said. And so if they want to add something to that, or maybe to change certain things that, or if there are misunderstandings on the part of the researchers, those are resolved. And so once this is done, the reading and rereading, or the critical reading in the light of the research objectives and research questions, this is something that is very important, that is done with transcripts. After that, the next thing, which is again not the next thing, it is a continuous process, thou, is to actually highlight, underline important chunks and points of data, and to make summaries, and to take critical notes and memos. And once this is done, this actually leads to the identification of main themes within a particular interview and across different interviews. And so drawing a thematic map at this stage will actually help in organizing the themes that have come out of the interview. And on the basis of all of this process, the researcher will be able to draw conclusions and to write those in the form of notes and in the form of conclusions in the research report. So this was a brief presentation regarding the general process of actually analyzing interview data in simple qualitative interview-based researches. Once again, questions and comments are welcome. And I must say that there are different types of interviews this process is basically aimed at the kind of semi-structured interviews. However, there will be some level of detail or maybe deviation in when we are responding to data or when we are analyzing data that is coming from more structured or completely unstructured interviews. So we will come to that in some future presentation.